Okay, Kate, I'm going to try and explain to you the American system of government as simply as I possibly can. Okay, then, so on your WhatsApp thing, you said you were confused by it. What did you say? I don't understand how it all works. I know there's the House, Senate, Judicial, I think you mean Judiciary, and they've got different roles. It just all seems to get tied up in, I think that's where it says bureaucracy, depends got no leverage, and something about woolly amendments. Right, okay, let's start at the beginning, shall we? So, as you know, Britain originally ruled North America, or the bit which is currently the USA. And they set up 13 colonies, Virginia being one of them, which basically had a governor, and the British basically allowed them to do what they wanted up until the British decided actually they wanted to get taxes out of them. And so the British government, basically in London, said we want taxes from you, etc., etc. As we know, these 13 colonies got rather upset about this. There was then a war between the 13 colonies versus Britain. And as I assume you know, the 13 colonies won. And no doubt they had a big party. Yay, we've won, nasty Britain's been defeated. Okay, George III can go and do one. They then had a problem because they now defeated nasty old Britain, and Britain had imposed nasty taxes on them, and Britain had imposed nasty soldiers on them, etc., etc., etc. Their new problem was, well, how are we going to run ourselves? How are we going to run this new country? And originally, they set up something called a confederacy. Basically what this was, each of the 13 colonies, we'll now call them states, like Virginia, New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, etc., etc. They basically were able to rule themselves, almost like 13 separate little countries. They had their own governor each, which is a bit like a little president. Each had their own parliament, and they basically did largely as they wanted. They did set up a central government based in Pennsylvania, but it had no powers, basically. And this lasted for about 10-15 years, but increasingly problems became evident. So there were disputes between some of the states, for example, and then there was no one to actually adjudicate which state should win that dispute. Other problems were things like there was this fear about what would happen if the British decided to attack again. You got 13 little states, each without an army. Okay, there's no central army. And there's this fear that one of them, the British might pick off New Hampshire, for example, or the French might come round and pick up, Georgia or Virginia or something like that. And they felt quite weak and helpless. And so what they decided to do is they decided to have a big meeting to decide how they're going to run themselves in the future. What changes were they going to make? So each state sent a number of delegates to Philadelphia in 1787. And these delegates, there were 96 in total. Hello, Zengi. They basically wrote this new government, which is the American Constitution as we see it today. Now, of these delegates, there were basically three camps of these delegates. You had one group led by George Washington, who wanted a strong central government, a bit like the British government in America. And he wanted this government to have a strong army, a strong executive, a decision-making body, because he said that's the only way to, stop the country from being invaded by foreigners and in order to expand America, etc., etc. You had another group on the other extreme, led by Thomas Jefferson, remember whose house we went to see last summer. He argued the opposite. He wanted a system of government where the central government was really weak. He argues that any government wants to take away people's rights. And therefore, any government that America should have should be limited, should be as small as possible, should not be able to do things, or certainly should not be able to do things easily. And then you had this third camp in the middle, led by James Madison, who basically were a bit of one and a bit of the other. And the American Constitution was essentially a compromise between the likes of George Washington and co, who wanted a strong central government, and the likes of Thomas Jefferson, who wanted a very weak kind of government. And if you read the American Constitution all the way through, it's a fascinating read, you'll see that certain bits you can think, oh yeah, I can see the influence of Thomas Jefferson here, or I can see the influence of George Washington's group here. Okay, right, so what did they create? Well, firstly, remember, well, they had various principles for this constitution. One principle was that the government should be limited. It should not be able to do things too easily. There should be obstacles in the way to make it difficult. So they would not like, for example, any of the founding fathers, the powers of like the UK Prime Minister. So, for example, Boris Johnson, with his majority in Parliament, can basically do what he likes, can't he? He can pass any law he wishes through the UK Parliament, and that can make big fundamental changes. A bit like the Blair government was also to do the same things, the Thatcher government as well. Mrs Thatcher, for example, passed a law which got rid of the Greater London Council, for example. Though in one act of Parliament, no trouble. There's nothing in theory, is there, to stop Boris Johnson passing a law tomorrow to close down the Scottish Parliament or the Welsh Assembly, or Welsh Parliament as it now is. Okay, so the Americans disliked this. They want a government that could do that, to have that type of power. They wanted a limited government, one that would find it difficult to do things. The other aim was they wanted this new form of government to protect the rights of the individual states. So the state of Virginia, which was basically ruled as a separate country almost, between the Confederacy after the War of Independence, they wanted to make sure that Virginia and New Hampshire and Pennsylvania and Maryland, etc., maintained most of their rights. Okay? And the third aim was that this new constitution should have some way to protect citizens from the state. Okay? Citizens should not have to endure like George III had done to Britain, where rights could be taken away of people willy-nilly. So they were the three main principles. So what they set up, basically, for limited government was a federation. What that means is that you've got a central government based in Washington, D.C., which is given certain powers by the Constitution. Okay? But also the Constitution says that each individual state also has certain powers. And what the Constitution does, it gives what's called enumerated powers, listed powers, which the states have, which the federal government in Washington, D.C. has. A couple of these powers are shared between both the states and the federal government. Things like taxation, for example, which is why there's federal taxes and the state taxes. Okay, but it's very clear, these are the powers of the states, these are the powers which we're going to give to Washington, D.C., the federal government to do. Okay, and the idea is that a president or a government in Washington, D.C. cannot just do what it likes. It's got to also, because it could be stopped by the states. So, for example, if the federal government in Washington, D.C. wanted to pass a law to say that all elections in America have to be held in the same way, every state's got to have the same rights in terms of voting, and ballot papers must go out by this date and that date. Well, actually, no government in Washington can do that because the Constitution says that the states are responsible for how they run elections. Which is why some states you have early voting, some states encourage postal voting, some states, as we know, like Georgia, have kind of tried to restrict certain groups from voting. Okay, so the idea is that it's limited government. So the federal government in Washington can do some things, the states can do lots of others. It's one way of trying to prevent Washington, D.C. doing as it likes. Citizens' rights are protected by the Bill of Rights in the Constitution. Okay, and state rights are protected, as I just said, by, the Constitution says these powers are held by the states. Interestingly, the 10th Amendment of the Constitution also says any power which we haven't given to the federal government, any power we've not mentioned, just assume that we meant the states should have those powers as well. So basically we're covering themselves, saying if we've forgotten anything, which we may well have done, just assume that the states have that power as well. So, when they set up the federal government in Washington, D.C., okay, they decided to have three branches. Again, this is like the British model. The UK government has three branches, don't we? Okay, we have the executive, which is like the Prime Minister and the Cabinet. We have the legislature, which is like the UK Parliament, so, you know, House of Lords, House of Commons, and we have the judiciary. They're the three branches of government, okay? All countries in the world have these three branches. What they were very keen on, though, in America is that these three branches, so you've got the executive branch, which is the UK Prime Minister, and the Cabinet. In the US, it's the President. Okay, the legislature in the UK is Parliament. In the US, it is Congress, which is the Senate and the House of Representatives. And then the judiciary in the UK is now the UK Supreme Court. In the US, it's the US Supreme Court. What they were very keen to do, though, is make sure that these three branches were separate. You cannot have one person in more than one branch. So, for example, Barack Obama, he was a senator, i.e. a member of the Parliament, the Senate, the legislature in America. When he won the presidency in 2008, he then had to resign his seat in the Congress, in the Senate, in order to become president. He could not be senator and president at the same time. Okay? That isn't true in Britain, is it? Because in Britain, the Prime Minister is also a member of Parliament. So in Britain, the executive and the legislature are fused. Okay? And what that means in practice is that in Britain, as long as the Prime Minister has a majority of seats, which all Prime Ministers have, they can basically use that to dominate Parliament and do what they like. Okay? Whereas in America, they were very keen that Congress should be separate from the executive. And the idea is that Congress should be able to block things which the President does. And vice versa. The President can also block things which Congress does. And that all fits into this principle about limiting government. You make things difficult. Laws do not pass through the American parliamentary system easily. It takes a lot of negotiation and lots of things fail. And the founding fathers think that's a good thing. Okay, it means only the best laws get through in their view. It should be hard to pass laws, basically. So you've got American Congress and you've got the American President who are separate. And then the judiciary is separate as well. So again, you're not allowed to be in the judiciary and the other two branches. You've got to resign one before you join the judiciary and vice versa. And again, the idea of that is about the independence of the judiciary. The judiciary, they argue, should be independent of politics. The same is true now in Britain. It wasn't true up until 2005, because up until 2005 the Supreme Court in Britain was in the House of Lords, but since 2005 it is now separate. So the judiciary in the UK has also been separated out from the other branches. Now, in America, the Constitution gives certain powers to the presidency, they give certain powers to Congress, and it's a bit vague on the Supreme Court, to be fair, okay? But these powers check each other. So, for example, the President of the United States is given the power as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, okay? Which means that he can deploy the Army and the Navy whenever and wherever he wishes to. He's in charge of the Armed Forces, which gives him a huge amount of power, doesn't it? Now, in order to check that power, to prevent the President from using forces willy-nilly, the Founding Fathers also said that Congress is responsible for the money, the power of the purse, in other words. So what they can do is they can say to the President, so the President wants to use the army, say, to go and invade Canada, for example. Congress can say, we disagree with that, so therefore we're going to cut the funding. So you can't use your army abroad because you've got no money to pay for them. So that's an example of these checks and balances. The President's given some powers, but at the same time Congress has the power to take away some of the power if it wants to. Want another example? Congress can pass laws, okay, as we know. That is then checked by the President, who has to sign those laws into law. A bit like what the Queen does in Britain. She officially signs laws into law. However, If the president doesn't like that law, which Congress has passed, he can veto it, which basically says, I forbid this law. It then goes back to Congress, and Congress can overturn that veto, so they can check the check if they like, but it requires a huge majority, which is quite hard to do. So each of these institutions checks each other, and the idea is this limited government. It makes things difficult. It stops the president becoming like a George III, if you like, or a UK Prime Minister. So that's the federal government. Now, the Supreme Court in America is actually quite vague in the Constitution, because the founding fathers didn't think it would be all that important. Within about 20 years of the Supreme Court being formed, they gave themselves the power in a case called Marbury versus Madison, which basically gave it the power to adjudicate what is and is not constitutional. So in other words, if there's a dispute over what is in the Constitution, it is the Supreme Court that decides who's right. So, for example, the city of Washington, D.C., probably about 30 years ago now, it passed a series of laws in that city which tried to restrict the use of firearms. Okay, they tried to make it more difficult for people to buy firearms. Now, they passed as law, and it was law in Washington, D.C. However, a court case arose called D.C. versus Heller, which said Washington, D.C. has broken the US Constitution. The Constitution's Second Amendment says citizens have the right to bear arms. These laws passed by Washington, D.C., the city itself, were trying to restrict people from having the right to bear arms. Therefore, Washington, D.C. has broken the Constitution. And the Supreme Court said yes, they have. And so those laws passed by the city of Washington, D.C. were declared unconstitutional, null and void. Okay? There's loads of examples of these. Congress in 1995 passed a law called the Communications Decency Act, which basically said that pornography could not be placed in magazines and lower shelves in shops. They couldn't be placed at the top shelves so kids couldn't see it or couldn't reach it. Okay? The Supreme Court said that was unconstitutional. Okay? Because they said it denies the right of free speech and freedom of expression. So there's lots and lots and lots of these sorts of cases. There's lots of them basically. So, and that's the power which the UK courts don't have, because in Britain the Parliament is sovereign, whereas in the US it's the Constitution. So the Constitution then limits government at a federal level. So the President's got certain powers, Congress has got certain powers, the Supreme Court's got certain powers, and each one checks the other, making sure that one doesn't get too powerful. And then on top of that, a further check, a further limitation, is the power of the states themselves. There's lots of things which the government of Washington can't do because it's a power which the states have. So most of the laws which you'll face in Virginia, for example, I bet about 90% of the laws and regulations you face in Virginia are not actually done at Washington, D.C., they're actually done at Virginia level. Okay? It's why you have things like the education system different in different states and all these sorts of things. You've got different taxes and all that kind of business. So I hope that clarifies a little bit about the federal government and the states. Just to add that over time, more power has gone to the federal government in Washington, D.C., because the Constitution is quite vague and wishy-washy in places. And so what you've seen is that since 1787, the federal government has increasingly taken over more powers from the states. Things like welfare. The Constitution says very vaguely about how the state's responsible for the morals and welfare of their citizens, which is a very vague and wishy-washy type of phrase. In the 1930s, in the Great Depression, the states said that they couldn't afford any welfare, they had no money coming in. Federal government, please will you help us out? Washington, D.C. said, yes, gladly we'll help you out, but then they never gave those powers back. Okay, so over time, you have seen Washington, D.C. increasing its powers over the states. Okay, well, I hope that makes some sense. If not, I'm sure you'll get back to me.